The old wrought iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the silent cemetery. As the new groundskeeper of Mountain Grove Cemetery, I had to start my shift just before sunset. The fading October light cast long shadows across the weathered headstones, and a light fog was beginning to roll in from the surrounding woods. The maintenance shed smelled of rust and decay. I fumbled for the light switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, illuminating walls lined with ancient tools. My predecessor, Old Jack, had disappeared 3 months ago, leaving everything exactly as it was, including his worn leather journal on the workbench. The police investigation had gone cold. They assumed he'd simply walked away from the job, but something about that never sat right with me. As I made my rounds, checking that all was secure for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weathered headstones seemed to lean at stranger angles than usual, and the fog had grown thick enough to obscure anything more than 20 feet ahead. The crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Back in the shed, I decided to look through Old Jack's journal. The yellowed pages contained typical maintenance logs, but as I flipped further, the entries became increasingly erratic. He'd drawn elaborate diagrams of certain grave plots and scrawled cryptic notes about patterns and connections. The final entries mentioned a series of fresh graves that formed a perfect geometric shape when mapped out. The next evening, I brought a map of the grounds and started marking the graves Jack had noted. My hands trembled as the pattern emerged. 7 graves formed an exact heptagon, all dug within the past year. Each one belonged to a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. Their bodies had been found in different locations around the county, but somehow they'd all been buried here. I knew I should have called the police immediately, but something compelled me to investigate further. After midnight, I took my shovel to the most recent grave. The dirt was still loose, having been filled in only 2 weeks ago. My rational mind screamed at me to stop as I began to dig, but I had to know the truth. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something solid. I cleared away more dirt with trembling hands, revealing the coffin's lid. The wood was expensive, polished mahogany, but something seemed wrong about the seals around the edges. They appeared to have been tampered with. I noticed strange scratches around the corners, as if someone had opened it after burial. That discovery led me to check the other graves in the pattern. Each coffin showed similar signs of tampering. Following the geometric lines between them on my map, they intersected at the cemetery's oldest mausoleum. Inside, behind a false wall I discovered by accident, I found a nightmare. A hidden room contained medical equipment, surgical tools, and detailed journals documenting horrible experiments. Polaroid photos were scattered across a metal table, showing young women in various stages of what looked like medical procedures. With growing horror, I recognized their faces from the obituaries, but these photos were dated after their supposed deaths. In the corner, I found Old Jack's cell phone, smashed to pieces, and his blood-stained uniform. The pieces came together as I studied the killer's journals. He was a surgeon who had been fired for unethical experiments. He'd bought off someone in the county coroner's office to falsify death certificates, allowing him to collect young women who had been declared dead but were actually in drug-induced comas. The cemetery provided him with the perfect cover. Who would question activity around fresh graves? I found the security camera feeds on an old laptop. Old Jack had discovered the operation by chance, just as I had. The footage showed him confronting the surgeon late one night. The struggle that ensued was brief. I watched in horror as Jack's life ended in this very room, his body likely buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the grounds. I called the police immediately. Within an hour, the cemetery was swarming with investigators. They found 3 women still alive in medically induced comas in a hidden sub-basement, barely clinging to life. The surgeon was arrested at his home the next morning. They found Old Jack's remains exactly where I thought they'd be, buried under a fresh Jane Doe marker in the paupers section. In the end, the killer had used his medical knowledge and the privacy of the cemetery to create his own private testing ground for experimental procedures. The 7 graves I'd found were failed experiments, women who hadn't survived his surgeries. The investigation revealed dozens more potential victims over the years at other cemeteries where he'd worked as a consulting pathologist. I still work as the groundskeeper at Mountain Grove. The families of the victims wanted the graves of their loved ones moved, and I don't blame them. Those plots remain empty now, the pattern broken. Sometimes on foggy evenings, I think about how close I came to becoming another body in the ground. Old Jack's journal sits in an evidence locker somewhere, but I don't need it to remember the patterns he discovered. They're etched into my memory, along with the knowledge that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural. They're the ones who walk among us, hidden behind respectable jobs and charming smiles, using the sanctity of death as a cover for their horrific deeds. I never planned to take over my grandfather's headstone carving business. The old workshop sat at the edge of Oakwood Cemetery, a small brick building filled with the tools of his trade: chisels, mallets, and slabs of granite waiting to be transformed into memorials. But when he fell ill last spring, someone had to keep the family business running. The first thing I noticed was how meticulously he kept his records. Every headstone had detailed sketches, measurements, and client information carefully filed away. But something caught my eye. A separate ledger, hidden behind a loose brick, filled with strange symbols and measurements that didn't match any graves I knew of. As I learned the trade, I started noticing oddities. Certain headstones my grandfather had carved shared identical measurements and symbols, despite being for unrelated people. They formed perfect lines through the cemetery when viewed from above. The dates of death clustered around specific lunar phases, but surely that was just coincidence. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen in traditional stone carving. Small and subtle, they were easy to miss unless you knew where to look. I found them tucked into corners of headstones, hidden beneath flourishes and decorative elements. When I asked other stone carvers about them, they seemed confused or quickly changed the subject. In my grandfather's office, I discovered old survey maps of the cemetery, dating back to the 1800s. Red lines connected certain plots, forming complex geometric patterns. Names were circled in his shaky handwriting, all young men who had died suddenly, their deaths ruled as accidents or unexplained natural causes. The basement archives held more disturbing finds. Hidden behind decades of invoices and order forms, I found newspaper clippings about missing person cases. Young men who had vanished without trace, their disappearances spanning generations. Each case coincided with the installation of one of those specially marked headstones. I began researching the history of stone carving and mortuary practices. There were whispers in ancient texts about secret societies of stone carvers who did more than just mark graves. They were record keepers of a darker sort, their symbols a code that tracked patterns of death that seemed too precise to be natural. Using modern mapping software, I overlaid the old survey maps with satellite images. The patterns were undeniable. Every marked grave corresponded to points of intersection in a vast geometric web. More disturbing, there were spots marked for future graves, plots that hadn't been filled yet. Against my better judgment, I excavated one of the oldest marked graves late one night. The coffin bore the same symbols as the headstone, carved into its lid. Inside, I found only a few bones, far too few for a complete skeleton. The rest of the space was filled with leather-bound books, their pages covered in my grandfather's handwriting. The books revealed a horrifying truth. My grandfather and his predecessors weren't just stone carvers. They were members of a scientific cult that had operated for centuries. They believed certain geometric patterns could predict death, and they used their position as headstone carvers to document and study these patterns. I installed security cameras around the workshop and cemetery. Night after night, I watched a group of men in dark suits visiting the marked graves. They carried scientific equipment, taking measurements and readings. Sometimes they would stand in specific formations, consulting old books similar to the ones I'd found. The pattern became clear as I dug deeper. These men were conducting experiments, using the geometric properties of death locations to predict where death would next occur. But they weren't just predicting. They were ensuring these deaths happened, maintaining the pattern through calculated murders disguised as accidents. When I examined my grandfather's tools more closely, I found traces of blood in the crevices. The symbols he carved weren't just decorative. They were a record of his involvement in each death, a coded confession carved in stone. Every marked grave represented someone who had died to maintain the geometric pattern. I took everything to the police, the books, maps, and surveillance footage. The investigation uncovered a centuries-old conspiracy. Prominent members of society were part of this cult of scientific murderers, including judges, doctors, and civic leaders. They believed they were serving a greater purpose, studying the mathematics of death through carefully orchestrated killings. The case made international headlines. Hundreds of deaths were re-examined, revealing an intricate web of murders spanning generations. My grandfather died in prison while awaiting trial, taking many secrets to his grave. The other cult members were eventually caught, their scientific equipment and ancient texts confiscated. I still run the stone carving business, but I've moved the workshop far from any cemetery. Each time I carve a headstone, I think about how this ancient craft was perverted by those who saw death as a mathematical equation to be solved. The symbols have all been documented now, a warning to future generations about how the human desire to find patterns in chaos can lead down dark paths. Sometimes I wonder if I've really found all the marked graves, or if somewhere out there, other stone carvers are still maintaining their geometric patterns of death, hidden in plain sight among the memorials to our loved ones. The mathematics of mortality they studied may have been nonsense, but the deaths were all too real. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters are those who cloak their evil in the disguise of scientific pursuit. The flower shop across from Riverside Cemetery had been in my family for 3 generations. Every morning, I would arrange bouquets for grieving families and deliver them to fresh graves. It was a quiet life, watching the seasons change through petals and leaves, until I noticed something strange about the flowers on certain graves. They never seemed to wilt. At first, I thought it was just good soil or lucky placement in the shade, but these flowers stayed perfect for weeks, sometimes months, defying nature. They were always white lilies, always arranged the same way, always on graves of young women. I hadn't sold these arrangements. They appeared overnight, their stems pushed deep into the earth. Being a florist means understanding soil and plant chemistry. I took samples from around these eternal flowers and had them analyzed. The results were disturbing. High concentrations of unusual minerals and synthetic compounds. Someone was feeding these flowers with something that wasn't just fertilizer. In my search for answers, I discovered an old shed near the cemetery's greenhouse. Inside were things no gardener would use: medical-grade chemical preservatives, synthetic hormone compounds, and notebooks filled with detailed records of soil modifications. The dates matched the appearances of the mysterious flowers. I mapped out every grave with the preserved flowers. They formed a perfect circular pattern, expanding outward like ripples in a pond. Each new flower appeared at precise intervals, marking the fresh grave of another young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances: poisoning, allergic reactions, unexplained organ failures. Under the microscope, the flowers revealed their secrets. Their cellular structure had been altered, crystalline formations threading through their tissues like delicate frost. These weren't just preserved flowers, they were being transformed by whatever was in the soil, becoming something between organic and mineral. Research led me to obscure botanical papers about experimental preservation techniques. A scientist had theorized that certain chemical compounds could create a symbiotic relationship between preserved human tissue and living plants. His funding was cut when test subjects showed signs of toxicity. He disappeared from academia 20 years ago. The pattern emerged like a twisted garden. Young women would receive anonymous flower deliveries, not from my shop. Weeks later, they'd die from mysterious poisonings. Their graves would sprout these immortal lilies, fed by whatever preserved remains lay beneath. Each death fed into the next, a horrible cycle of cultivation. The cemetery's greenhouse wasn't just for growing funeral flowers. Hidden behind rows of normal plants, I found an elaborate hydroponic system. Specialized equipment regulated the flow of chemicals into test plants. Logbooks detailed experiments with different preservation compounds, tracking their effects on both flowers and buried tissue. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the true horror. The preserved flowers weren't just growing on the graves. Their roots formed an interconnected network, reaching down to the caskets below. Each new grave added to this web, creating a vast underground garden fed by preserved human tissue. The killer wasn't just taking lives, he was transforming death into a twisted form of eternal life. The police investigation uncovered decades of careful cultivation. The killer, a former botanical researcher, had been experimenting with ways to preserve both human tissue and flowers in perfect symbiosis. Each victim was carefully selected and poisoned with compounds that would prepare their bodies to feed his immortal garden. Forensic analysis of the flowers revealed traces of human DNA integrated into their cellular structure. The killer had discovered a way to bind preserved human tissue with living plants at a molecular level. Each flower was a grotesque hybrid, perpetually blooming, fed by the remains of his victims through a network of chemically modified roots. They had to quarantine the entire cemetery. Hazmat teams carefully removed each preserved flower and treated the soil to neutralize the chemical compounds. The roots had spread further than anyone expected, creating a vast underground network of preserved tissue and modified plant matter. Some of the oldest flowers had roots that reached dozens of graves away from their origin. The killer was found in a makeshift laboratory beneath his house, surrounded by flowers in various stages of transformation. His research notes revealed plans to expand his garden to other cemeteries, creating a vast network of preserved life. In his mind, he wasn't killing these women, he was giving them immortality through his flowers. I've sold the flower shop now. I couldn't bear to look at flowers anymore, knowing what I know about their potential for darkness. The cemetery has reopened, but the soil had to be replaced in many sections. Sometimes I drive past and see fresh flowers on the graves, normal ones that wilt and die as nature intended. But I can't help wondering if somewhere in another cemetery, strange flowers are blooming that never die, fed by the remains of the dead in an endless cycle of unnatural preservation. The scariest part isn't just what he did, it's how long he did it without anyone noticing. We all accepted the beauty of these endless flowers without questioning their nature. Sometimes the most horrifying things hide in plain sight, dressed in the disguise of natural beauty. Every time I see white lilies now, I look closely at their petals, checking for that telltale crystalline sheen that marks the boundary between life and death.